Hello, AP Bio class. We just have a little bit of notes left to wrap up our discussion of photosynthesis. Hopefully you are successful with this ed puzzle. As a quick reminder, everybody needs to do it themselves because it is graded through Schoology. You can do it as many times as you want, so you can get those full points. It is graded. After you are done with this ed puzzle, you can get back to work with your group working on the photosynthesis POGL. And if you have any time left, I did leave the handout so that you could start the algae lab report. That will be the next lab that we will start tomorrow when I get back. So if you wanted to try your best to formulate the question and the background information, I will get you more caught up on that tomorrow. But if you have other things you can do instead, that's totally fine. Just make sure you're busy and making good use of your time. All right, so let's get started talking about photosynthesis. So yesterday we talked a little bit about the two parts of photosynthesis. We always think about the general equation about how energy, water, and carbon dioxide go in and sugar comes out. But the big process is actually split into two individual processes. First, light will help to split water, which releases oxygen, and create the energetic compounds ATP and NADPH. The light reactions also create a hydrogen gradient, and that hydrogen gradient is really, really important for the second step of the process, which we call the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle is where the actual carbon fixation takes place. So by carbon fixation, we mean that we are grabbing carbon out of the atmosphere and assimilating it into an organic molecule inside of a living thing. And so that happens in the dark reactions or the Calvin cycle of photosynthesis. So along with the ATP and NADPH that was made in the light reactions, we're going to take that carbon and we're going to make it into sugar. It's a little more complicated than that, which I'm sure that you can guess. But collectively, this is the process that fuels and feeds the entire living world. So it is something that is very important to talk about. So first, let's talk the light reactions. The light-dependent reactions, as its name suggests, requires light, and light is used to strip electrons from water. Once we take those electrons away, then what's left is oxygen, and that oxygen is then released. That is the oxygen that you and I are breathing right now. So remember that light is a form of electromagnetic radiation. It's just one type of energy on a whole spectrum, and the sun actually releases many different types of electromagnetic radiation. So it's actually a very narrow band of the sun's emittance that can actually be utilized by chlorophyll and by other pigments found in the chloroplast. Like other electromagnetic waves, it travels in waves, and we can measure those waves and talk about wavelength and talk about frequency. So when we're looking at different types of visible light, the different colors are due to the different wavelengths and frequencies, so they carry different amounts of energy. Red light is just barely visible light. It's just a little bit shorter than the infrared light as far as wavelength goes, and it has the lowest energy. As we move our way through the rainbows, through the Roy G. Biv, the violet light has shorter wavelength and a higher energy. That also means it has a higher frequency. And on the end of the violet end of the spectrum, we have ultraviolet radiation. So that's one way you can remember how these colors are oriented is infrared is below visible light, it's on the red side, and ultraviolet is just on the other side of the violet side of the spectrum. Hopefully you guys know, just, from being humans, that UV light, X-rays, and gamma rays are not good for you. They can be very, very damaging. Just like visible light can cause sunburns, these can cause radiation burns. But anything below the energy of visible light, it really doesn't affect living things. I mean, infrared, if you have a lot, it's heat. So if you have a lot of heat, it can affect living things. But microwaves and radio waves are probably passing through your body all the time, and it really doesn't have any effect on the cells or the DNA that's inside of them. So those have less energy, which is why they don't really cause us any problems. So inside the chloroplast, the actual chemical substances that harvest the light are called pigments. And lots of plants have lots of different pigments because we know that not all plants are the same color, especially their leaves. They can be a brighter green or a darker green. Some are even orange or purple or yellow. And so different pigments will absorb different wavelengths. And even if a plant looks green, it probably has more than chlorophyll. It has multiple pigments that we call accessory pigments. And keep in mind that wavelengths that are not absorbed and utilized by the chloroplast will be reflected. And so that's actually the color we see. So the colors that are not used is what bounces back. The colors that are absorbed are the ones that are utilized by the plant to perform photosynthesis. So here's just a couple of these different types of plant pigments. The ones that do photosynthesis are here on the left. So chlorophyll actually comes in two varieties, chlorophyll A, which is a little more blue-green, and chlorophyll B, which is a little more yellow-green. Carotenoids, which carrots are named after the carotenoids that they contain. They're actually precursors of vitamin A. And so they come in yellow, which is xanthophyll, and orange, which are carotenes. We also have protective pigments in plants that live in areas that receive a lot of direct sunlight. These are the anthocyanins, which are either red, purple, or blue. So those do not really do photosynthesis because they're reflecting almost all of the light and absorbing very little of it. So again, just remember that when we're looking inside the chloroplast, these pigments are found in the thylakoid, and the light that we see, the color that we see, is of course reflected. So one way that we can quantify the type of energy absorption for a whole plant is by taking all of its pigments and graphing them. This is called an absorption spectrum. And so we can see that where we have these peaks is where that pigment is really, really good at absorbing, so it doesn't reflect it very much. So we can see that our chlorophylls and our carotenoids, which are all present, are really good at absorbing between around that 450 nanometer wavelength, which is like a pretty blue-violet color. We have almost no absorbance between 5 and 600, which is the yellow-green area, and then we have a little bit more absorbent in the red-orange. So if this were to come up as a test question and it said, what color would this plant look like? You'd want to look at the areas that we have the lowest absorbance because we have the greatest reflectance. And that would be the color that we see. So the answer would be kind of green, yellow-green. Okay, so the actual units that do most of the work in the light-dependent reactions are called photosystems. So these are proteins that are embedded in the membrane of the thylakoid. And so you see a photon coming in here and hitting one of these green pigment molecules. And what that pigment will do is it gets excited. It will get energized, and it will start to move really fast until it bounces into the reaction center complex, and it actually energizes an electron. So it passes that energy onto these electrons that have been stripped from water. Those electrons can then go through the other steps in order to produce ATP. So most plants don't even just have one, they have two of these, and notice that they are out of order. Photosystem 2 comes first. Sometimes it's called PS 680 because that's the wavelength of light that it absorbs best. Photosystem 1 happens second, and it is sometimes called PS 700 because it absorbs a little bit lower energy light, more in that red-orange area, at about 700 nanometers. So they're named according to discovery, not according to when they're actually used, which is super annoying. So let's talk about what actually happens during these light-dependent reactions. There's 3 steps. We have photosystem 2, we have an electron transport chain that connects them, and then we have photosystem 1. So during photosystem 2, the first thing that happens is that chlorophyll is going to absorb that energy from the light. It's then going to energize electrons. Those electrons are going to return to ground state. They're going to give off that energy, but as they do, they pass through the electron transport chain. As they pass through, this energy is used to pump hydrogens across the thylakoid membrane, and this creates an electrochemical gradient. So it's used to accomplish active transport. This gradient will then be used as the hydrogen ions pass through ATP synthase to produce ATP, and it also is used to make NADPH. The NADPH is actually directly created in photosystem 1. So oxygen is also released in this process through the stomata. So let's look a little bit more carefully at our diagram here. Light hits the thylakoid, water is split into oxygen, and then we have photosystem 2, the electron transport chain, photosystem 1. That creates ATP and NADPH. So this is a nice diagram from your book that shows more of a visual representation of what this electron transport chain is doing. So the photon is energizing that electron, it's boosting it up to a higher energy level. And as it passes through the proteins of the electron transport chain, it pushes that ATP synthase. It's the same protein that we saw in the mitochondria that do cell respiration. It's the exact same one. We're utilizing it to store a little bit of energy to use later. Then a second photon will energize that same electron and store that energy as NADPH. So the Calvin cycle is also known as the light independent or the dark reactions, and this is where the actual carbon fixation takes place. We're going to take in CO2 from the environment, and again, that's through the stomata, the same place that the oxygen moved out of in the light dependent reactions, and that carbon is going to be fixed by an enzyme called rubisco. Rubisco is a very important molecule, and it's found throughout the plant kingdom. And it probably is the reason that plants are able to do photosynthesis so effectively, even though our carbon dioxide levels are only 1 or 2 or 3% of our atmosphere. Rubisco is so good about grabbing it out of the atmosphere that it can still do photosynthesis. So here's the big picture of the dark reactions. CO2 comes in, it goes through this Calvin cycle, uses the energy of ATP and NADPH to make sugars. So there's a lot of adaptations that we see in this dark cycle, especially to adapt for dehydration. We know that plants don't have the ability to just get up and walk around and find more water. They can grow deeper roots, or they can try to have other physiological adaptations to prevent desiccation or dehydration. In hot, dry places or hot, dry days, the plants can actually close up those little pores, the stomata where the gas exchange occurs, because water vapor also escapes out those stomata. And so that conserves water, but it essentially stops photosynthesis, because without the carbon dioxide being able to get in and the oxygen being able to get out, photosynthesis is very, very limited. So molecular adaptations also occur, because that's not, you can't do that forever. The stomata need to eventually open up again. Where we can either spatially separate the light and dark reactions so that they happen in different parts of the cell, or they can do temporal separation, which CAM plants have those. So on the left, we see the C4. So we actually have different cells within the plant tissue that does the different parts. So the light reactions are going to happen in the mesophyll, and the dark reactions happen deeper. That protects the plant from releasing so much water. And then pineapples are CAM plants, so they actually do the dark reactions at night and the light reactions during the day. But do notice that the carbon has to get fixed at night. So we have to, it's kind of a constant process between the two. So here's a more detailed diagram showing this whole process of photosynthesis. Very complex, a lot of moving parts. In your POGL, you'll dig a little bit deeper into these intermediate steps. But again, I'm not going to ask you to recreate this. I'm not going to ask you to fill in the blanks. I want you to be able to look at it, analyze it, and understand it, which is exactly what you'll be doing with your group in the POGL. Okay, so that wraps up Chapter 8. Keep in mind that the process of photosynthesis utilizes light energy to make carbohydrates. First, we have to split water, and then we use the energy from ATP and NADPH to create sugars. All living systems require a constant input of free energy, so this is the way that plants will get the energy from sunlight into the biosphere. And organisms capture and store free energy to use in biological processes. We've talked a lot about two particular processes, cell respiration and photosynthesis. So at this point, if you could get with your group and work on your POGL, when you finish that, you can work on some other homework or maybe read AR if you still have some points to get. So I will be back tomorrow, and reach out over email or remind if you have any questions.